Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Gilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and these are the 10 best Murlocs of all time. Now for this list, when I say all time, that's exactly what I mean. These are the Murlocs which have had the biggest influence on a given meta in their respective eras. So even if they've rotated out of standard format, for instance, and they may not be played today, if they're a card that was played in a past expansion, they might still make this list, as long as at some point in Hearthstone's history, they were an important and powerful card. I also am only considering cards which have the actual Murloc tag on the card, so Murloc synergy cards or spells that summon Murlocs are not eligible for this list. It's minions themselves which are Murlocs. All that said, let's go ahead and jump into the list. Starting off at the number 10 spot, it's Rockpool Hunter, a card which clearly has only recently become powerful because this was released with Journey to Ungrow. But the great thing about Rockpool Hunter is, unlike most Murlocs, he's really not sacrificing a lot in stats to make up for his powerful Murloc synergy effect. So you get really good stats for a 2-drop, not to mention this battle cry here is very powerful when a deck is able to develop strong Murlocs earlier in the game that Rockpool Hunter can then follow up. For instance, as we see very commonly with this card in Murloc Paladin, which has been one of the most dominant decks in the Journey to Ungrow meta. And since this is sort of the defining card in that deck, or the card which I think has really enabled it to become so powerful in those first few turns of the game, Rockpool Hunter has earned a spot on this list. At the number 9 spot is another Murloc from Journey to Ungrow that's very popular in Murloc Paladin, and both of these cards might eventually have ranked higher on this list, but since they've only had this one expansion to shine, it's really hard to say that they've been the most important or most powerful Murlocs of all time. All that said, Hydrologist does also have one of the best stat and effect total combinations of any of the Murlocs we've seen in the game thus far, because again, you get a fairly reasonable body for a 2-drop, and this battle cry being able to discover a secret is really powerful. It ends up working in both aggressive decks, but also as a really nice 2-drop in late game decks, because when you get cards like Getaway Kodo and you're able to create multiple Tyrian Forgerings, it turns out Hydrologist is pretty good even outside of Murloc decks, and that's why I think it's a more important card in general than Rockpool Hunter before it, and the kind of card that is probably just going to be played in Paladin for as long as it's in standard format, and the kind of card that's probably just going to be a good option in wild format forever, making Hydrologist a very deserving card for this list. Moving on to the number 8 spot is Coldlight Seer, one of the old school buff style Murlocs that can really help you capitalize on a Murloc board by making them much sturdier with 2 extra health. This one might not be quite as popular today, although it does still show up in Murloc Paladins of the more aggressive variety, but way back in Hearthstone's past, long ago, before most of you will even remember, back in the beta era of Hearthstone basically, and even perhaps earlier than that, Swarm style Murloc decks were one of the first prominent archetypes that showed up because it was a pretty obvious tribal synergy that people could utilize to win games, and Coldlight Seer was a really important piece of that puzzle. So even though this one has kind of fallen off over time and probably gone long periods of time without seeing play, the fact that it sees a little bit of play today and the fact that it used to be played a ton and it's a part of the classic set all add up to the fact that this has actually been one of the better Murlocs in Hearthstone's history. Moving on to my number 7 spot is actually a Murloc in a very similar vein to the previous one, another part of the classic set here with Murloc Tidecaller, another key piece to those old Murloc Swarm decks, but a card which is even more important perhaps today with Murloc Paladin as that perfect 1-drop opener that swarms really nicely with Rockpool Hunter, some previous cards on this list, that allows you to get off to a very fast start and just pressuring your opponent in some crazy ways. You know, Hearthstone historically has been driven by very powerful 1-drops with things like Undertaker and Tunnel Trog, and believe it or not, Murloc Tidecaller has kind of been revitalized in this Journey to Ungrow era as one of the stronger 1-drop openers in the game. So even though, again, a card that hasn't always been popular, it hasn't always been played, it used to be very good, and it's good once again at making Murloc Tidecaller a very fitting card for this list. Up next at the number 6 spot is Blue Gill Warrior, another staple classic Murloc, in fact part of the basic set this time, so it's one of those free cards everybody gets, so it's in everybody's beginner decks and budget decks. Everyone knows and loves this card, but it's been a really important part of a variety of different Murloc decks. Most recently, probably, we've seen it popular with the Finja package, with Murloc War Leaders and Bluegill Warriors and Finja himself all together, so you can do some crazy combos. Basically, when you're able to summon some Murlocs with Finja, you get these buffed Bluegill Warriors with charge that are really good. It was also a very important part of any Fin Can Happen Paladin or combo Murloc Paladin back in the day because it was a charger. So the fact that this does have charge has enabled it to really carve out a special different kind of niche in Murloc decks that none of the other Murlocs really satisfy. Especially since Old Murkai moved to wild format only, Bluegill Warrior has been the charge Murloc, which does give him a unique utility that the other Murlocs just can't satisfy, and that's why he's so high on this list and such an important part of the Murloc tribe. Speaking of Finja, Finja the 5-drop, the Flying Star, is actually the number 5 card on my list. As I mentioned, the Finja package was really dominant near the end of the mean streets of gadgets and meta, and this is still a card that pops up from time to time because if you're able to run that Finja package specifically with the Bluegill Warriors and the War Leaders, that can do some really crazy things for mid-game swings. We've also just seen this in Murloc Paladin as just a Murloc body that's good to stick on the board. It can absorb some buffs, but it can also just summon a few Murlocs to do things like buff those Tide Colors or just help you get more bodies out for your Murloc War Leaders. So ultimately, just seems like a really good card, one of the more interesting and unique variations on Murlocs. It does a couple really interesting, cool things because it's one of the only Murloc legendaries, right? There's just a few that we've ever seen. So Finja, not probably a defining Murloc card. It's not in every deck ever, but certainly one that can, by himself, help create a Murloc deck, and I think that's really important. Moving on to the number 4 spot is a 4-drop, and another legendary. In fact, this one's Old Murkai, though, and some people might have forgotten how crazy this card could be because we just haven't seen it in a long time once it was moved out of standard format. It's just kind of been forgotten to time a little bit, but this was the centerpiece, the shining star of those really old Murloc decks I talked about because it could be such a strong finisher, and it's actually sometimes hard to kill too, so even if you don't use it as a finisher, it has enough stats for a Murloc that when you play it on curve and you've done a great Murloc opener, it's usually just the thing your opponent can't answer, and it pushes so much damage that it wins you games in and of itself. Old Murkai was also a part of any Fin Can Happen Paladin combo decks that I described before he was rotated out. And of course, for a little while, those were top tier decks that were very difficult to beat and frustrating to play against. So at the end of the day, Old Murkai is sort of the OG Murloc that's had a pretty powerful and lasting legacy on Hearthstone. Even if we don't see him a ton or think about him lately, he's still a card you shouldn't forget. Moving on to my number 3 spot is a card that might actually surprise some people to see it so high on this list because it's not always a card we think about as being a Murloc card, but that's actually why it's so high on this list, is because Coldlight Oracle is one of the very, very few Murlocs in the game that has been able to play outside of Murloc decks. In other words, sometimes decks that just need a ton of card draw, particularly really aggressive decks that empty their hand, or perhaps burn decks that are looking to find specific kind of burn spells, like mages have utilized this in the past to dig for fireballs and frostbolts and all that stuff. Those kinds of decks can still use Coldlight Oracle. So this isn't a card that's refined or defined specifically by Murloc synergies and having other Murlocs around it. It's one of the few that has broken that mold, stepped outside the world of Murlocs, and still found ways to be played. Of course, it also used to get played in old school Murloc decks too, so it still had that important part of Murloc's history, but it's made homes in a variety of different decks throughout the eras. Now, I don't know that it's ever necessarily been part of a tier 1 deck at any given point, but it's been so consistently okay and in so many different decks throughout the years that I still think Coldlight Oracle has been one of the best Murlocs in Hearthstone's history. And my number 2 card is another Murloc that has actually been played outside of Murloc decks. This time around, it's the legendary Sir Finley Mrrgglton from League of Explorers. Of course, this guy and his battle cry are so good and so unique that a lot of different decks have found ways to utilize him. Getting a new hero power is often a very desirable thing because sometimes not all classes' hero powers line up with the direction of their deck. For instance, Pirate Warriors, when Sir Finley Mrrgglton was still in standard format, really didn't like having armor up because that's a super defensive hero power, so Sir Finley Mrrgglton allowed them to get things like Hunter's hero power to do damage or Warlock's hero power to just refill their hand with cards at the cost of health, all of which they love. But other classes have utilized this too. It worked really well with things like the Curator. If you just wanted to run one Murloc and get that card draw from the Curator, Sir Finley Mrrgglton made a great way to do that, because often life tap, if you get it, it's such a game-winning kind of hero power that Sir Finley Mrrgglton just occasionally rolled into that and gave you a high roll chance at victory that you otherwise wouldn't have found. So a card that just saw a lot of play across a variety of classes, across all kinds of archetypes, and was the kind of card you saw all the time in Hearthstone while it was in standard format, and of course is still finding some ways to be played in wild format too. So I think this is going to be one of those cards, since it's so unique, and that battlecry does something that nothing else we've ever seen has done. It's the kind of card that's just going to continue to see play for the future of Hearthstone, as the foreseeable future. Sir Finley Mrrgglton will occasionally show up in decks and carve out a home as that really unique kind of puzzle piece that certain decks need. Sir Finley Mrrgglton has been certainly one of the best Murlocs ever. But in my mind, he's not quite the best. When you talk about Murlocs and the most impactful Murloc cards, I think it all goes back to this guy right here. It is the Murloc Warleader. Basically, any time there has been a deck that utilized Murlocs, this one has been a part of it, just because this effect is so darn good and does everything that Murlocs want to do, which is utilize each other's bodies and use the fact that they can swarm a board to build a ton of stats and leverage those stats into often damage to the face, which Murloc Warleader is really good at doing, because not only is it a 3/3 itself, but this buff means that you're adding so much attack to the board. Also a little bit of health too, which shouldn't be taken for granted, because that does help usually stabilize those boards and prevent your opponent from killing them. But there's nothing worse for an opponent to see than dropping that Warleader on turn 3 to just cement a giant board of Murlocs. That usually signals that the game is over. But it's not just the swarm style Murloc decks that utilize Warleader, you know, like the old Murlocs of yore or the Paladins of today. It's also been used in combo Murloc with Anything Can Happen, just because it buffed those charging boards so significantly. It's been used with the Finja package as a key piece to make the Finja turns so powerful. So basically, any of the sort of meta-defining decks that utilize Murlocs, Murloc Warleader has been right there as the centerpiece that enabled all of the cool tricks that they do, whether it be the combo burst damage or just the value off Finja or stabilizing those swarm-style boards. Murloc Warleader was there and made it possible, and that to me is why Murloc Warleader is quite clearly, actually, and quite dominantly the best Murloc card of all time. And there you have it. That's my list. The 10 best Murlocs of all time. There were certainly some good cards left off this list, a few of which I'm sure you guys are going to tell me in the comments below, which I'm happy to hear. What do you think deserved to be on this list that didn't make the cut? What did I overestimate as far as positioning was concerned? What did I get right? What did I get wrong? I'd love to hear all those takes in the comments below, so please share them. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.